Welcome to the Mississippi Library Commission Continuing Education webinar. I'm Mary Mackin, and today we are covering Storytime to enhance your library's programming for your community. Whether you're an experienced librarian or new to the field, we hope you find today's session insightful and inspiring. Today is just a brief overview of what Storytime is and the basic elements to include. We aren't going to delve super deeply into specifics today, but we will in the future, like the December series focusing on story times for different age groups. So what is Storytime? It's an organized time to read chosen stories aloud to a group of children, but it's also so much more than that. Children can sing songs, take movement breaks, interact with their caregivers and peers, and complete developmentally appropriate crafts or activities. Storytime can look pretty different depending on several factors, like the physical space you have available to you, the age group you're targeting, your patron population, your branch size, and the resources that are available to you. So Storytime has a positive impact on child development. It allows opportunities for children and their caregivers to bond, as well as practice serve and return, especially for young babies and toddlers where maybe you're having lap story time or the caregiver has a more active role in your story time space. And so serve and return is basically when a child initiates an interaction and the caregiver responds. And this is crucial for the brain development of babies and toddlers. It's also a fantastic time to model appropriate child and caregiver interaction, as well as showcasing things that caregivers can do at home to help their children to grow. Because some of the things that maybe you're doing during your story time, they could try at home. Maybe they know some songs that their child loves, but they're looking for some new ideas, or they may just not realize that it's actually really good for their child's development to sing songs at home and do things like finger plays together and how to read together. And it also helps to foster a love of reading and stories from a very early age. So it also helps to foster early literacy skills through talking, singing, reading, writing, and playing. And the development of these skills is the first step in the development of the crucial skills that will then come into play when children start to read. So those skills like phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension are all tied to having those early skills that they practice through talking, singing, reading, writing, playing. And Storytime is also a great way to show a child how to physically navigate a book, which is something that may seem like common sense or second nature to an adult, but until you know, a child doesn't explicitly know, with books that are written in English, we open them this way, we read from left to right, that kind of thing. They can't read yet, so they may not know this is right side up versus upside down. And it's also a great opportunity for children to practice age-appropriate gross and fine motor skills through movement activities. You can use scarves and shakers. You can do finger plays. You can do an age-appropriate craft to really practice those fine motor skills. So it's kind of a great way overall to hit on a lot of the things that will be really beneficial to a child's development in early childhood. And so when you're planning a story time, all story times will have similar components, such as a story being read aloud and opportunities for movement activities, but they'll look different depending on the time that's allotted, the age group, your space available to you, your resources available to you, the time available to you. And so probably one of the most important things with a story time is to be consistent. Try to keep the same structure each week and only change the actual content. And I'll show an example of a schedule in a later slide. But for example, if maybe after you read your second story, you play a song that the children can dance to, they're probably going to be expecting that and looking forward to that. So if you change things up on them, they might be disappointed or even confused. Children really thrive on structure and routine, and that's not something that every child gets at home. So it's really great to have somewhere where they can come every week and they know that it's predictable and they know what to expect and they kind of know what's going on. And kind of a great way to also reinforce that routine is if you have something like an easel or a board, or somewhere you could even just display like schedule cards where you're like, we're going to do a welcome, then a book, then a song. It can be a great way to let children and their caregivers know what to expect. Like if a child is on the verge of a meltdown or a tantrum, as young children tend to do, their parent can say, okay, just one more song and then we can leave. So kind of, things like that can help to set you up for some success. And then that way you also might not have a bunch of children. Well, when are we going to get to the dance? When are we going to get to the dance? That way, the caregiver can point out, or you can quickly just point to, well, look, we're right here on the schedule. We have one more story and then we'll do the dance, kind of just helping to set yourself up for success in that way. And make sure that you're allowing yourself time for setup and cleanup, especially if you're doing a messier craft like painting. You should also account for those who arrive early or any stragglers that are slow to leave. Especially if you're trying to clean up, but you have maybe a couple caregivers who wish to speak to you. So just make sure that you are accounting for that when you're scheduling your time. And probably the most important thing is to let your story time flow and trust your instincts. While you should have a plan, you can be ready to deviate as needed. At the end of the day, you know your patrons best. You know what they need. You know what you need. And don't be afraid to make decisions on the fly if you think it will help things to run more smoothly. So remember that there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all type of scheduling. This is kind of an example of if you had a solid hour, an idea of what you could do. So we'll talk more about each of these components in their own slides, but typically what Storytime will end up usually looking like is, your welcome, your first story, maybe a finger play action song movement activity, second story, finger play action song movement activity, third story, dance stretch movement activity. So if you notice, there's kind of a theme here where typically, you might do a story where they're typically sitting and listening, and then you do something more active because younger children, they're not as used to having a ton of downtime. So it's good to split it up and give them an opportunity to get moving before they sit and listen. And then, you have your closing, and then you might do a craft or activity. And we'll get more into this in the following slides. But again, if you only have half an hour, obviously you're probably not going to have time to do everything. So you kind of have to pick and choose based on the time that you have available to you, the resources that you have, the group that you're working with, and it's kind of just, it can be a certain amount of trial and error, and that's completely okay. So the first thing you're going to do is welcome your patrons to Storytime. So before you get started, you can use this time to welcome your patrons to your Storytime, let them know what you're doing that day, and share any expectations that you have. This can be, children need to stay on the carpet, or they're welcome to, stand if they don't want to sit for that long, but maybe they need to be at the back so that everybody can see, but they can't walk around and run because it's a safety issue. If you have props like a felt board, a flannel board, a puppet, you can say, this is my space, and please don't come into this area. Please make sure that your child doesn't come into this area. These are not for them to touch. These are to be used as part of the story time. And you can also, and it can be pretty brief, like you don't need to give a whole great big long welcome spiel, especially if you end up having regulars every week, they'll kind of know. So you can just, touch on maybe if there's something that they do need a reminder on every week, like maybe you get a puppet and you have 3 kids who every week run up because they want to touch the puppet. So then that would be a good time to remind them of whatever your ground rules are. Maybe you have a set time where they can come up and pet the puppet, but maybe your puppet's shy and they don't want to be pet a lot. So that's kind of a good time to go ahead and get that out of the way. And then that way, if it comes up, it can just be a brief reminder versus, okay, let's stop and address this. And so you can also sing a song to welcome children and caregivers to Storytime. There are some great examples of songs for Storytimes available online. I'll link a couple of my favorite places to find things in the description below. And to encourage a sense of familiarity, I would suggest using the same song or two, kind of depending on how much time you have. from week to week. So it's kind of a great way to remind everybody, as the caregivers may be conversing, the children might be playing, okay guys, it's time to regroup and get started. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a board or a place to display it available, you can write out the routine or display schedule cards so that caregivers can know what to expect. And if you have early attendees and you want them to have something to do, I would suggest not having toys out, because especially for young children, that can be something that's hard to take away from them when you're ready to get started. So maybe having some board books out, and then that's something that might be easier for them to put away. You know, these are books that you can tell caregivers they're welcome to hold on to and check out at the end of the story time. That way they have something that maybe they can just put to the side, and the caregiver can say, okay, we're gonna do story time now, but we can take this home with us. And if when you're trying to read, if the child is still looking at the book, don't stress about it, because they're probably copying what you're modeling and they're practicing those early literacy skills. So I've gone ahead and just linked a few of my favorite places to find welcome and goodbye songs. These will all be linked in the description below, and these are also places where you can find a ton of other resources like story suggestions, maybe suggestions for certain age groups, craft and activity suggestions, songs, those kinds of things. And I would maybe consider for your welcome specifically, as well as your goodbye songs, which I'll get into more in our closing slide, is maybe try to use the same songs from week to week to develop a sense of familiarity, because maybe the child and the caregiver will know, oh, I hear Wake Up Feet, for instance, is one that I've been using for things. I know it's time to get started. They get excited, and it's something where if you're doing new songs from week to week, they might not know the lyrics and movements right away, but that way that welcome song is also a way for them to get started with something they're familiar with. And after attending for a couple times, they're able to participate in, they know the lyrics, they know the movements, they get excited. And it's also kind of a great way to welcome patrons who haven't been there before and get them to feel welcome and kind of help them to warm up versus just jumping right into your story time. So when you're choosing books, which books you choose will differ depending on what age group you're planning your story time for. I'll delve more into specifics in our December 4-part webinar series on planning age-appropriate story times. But for now, here are a few of the key things that you can keep in mind. So try to find books that fit your theme if they're available, but it's okay if not every book is perfectly on theme, especially for, infant toddler story times. There may not be as many books that are appropriate for them as maybe there would be for a preschool story time. And we'll talk more about what I mean by that in just a minute. Try to find books that aren't too text heavy. I love books like, for example, Frog and Toad, like Amelia Bedelia. A lot of those books are great for older children because you probably aren't really going to be able to hold their attention as much, especially for younger children, if you're reading a book where you open the page and it's just a wall of text. And kind of going off of that, try to look for books that have interesting illustrations and are brightly colored. You don't need to look for books that are like super poppy and almost overstimulating, but you do need to find books that are going to be interesting for them to look at while you're reading so that they don't get bored. And it can help to stimulate them. And high contrast images are especially beneficial for young babies. And try to choose books that everyone will be able to see. Board books are great for children or babies and toddlers content-wise, but they can be harder to see because they are typically smaller. So that's something where you may have to take the size of the group that you serve into consideration and figure out, okay, will everybody be able to see this book? And most of all, choose books that are fun. Choose books that you think the children in your group will enjoy. You can respond to, if you get the same 12 kids every week and there's something you discover that they think is funny, or they're all really obsessed with dinosaurs, you can find a way to work that in. Or if there's like one joke you've told that they love, maybe they're on a kick about the little old woman who swallowed a fly. There's a bunch of different versions of those books, so that's also something you could kind of play into. So I've chosen a few examples of Storytime books that will work well for different age groups. So for babies, you want to pick books that are simple and high contrast, with no more than a couple lines of text per page. Board books can be a great place to start since they're often shorter and targeted towards babies content-wise, but make sure that everyone in the audience will be able to see, and don't feel like you can only use board books for baby story time. So I have a few examples. So Clip Clop is a great example. Again, this is a board book and it's a smaller board book, so you may have to decide on a case-by-case basis, could everybody see this? Is it a reasonable book for me to use? And this is great because there's not too much text per page. It has some repetitive elements, you know, it's kind of the same thing over and over. It repeats clip clop, clippity clop. There's some elements where it can be made interactive, especially, you know, if you're doing like a baby or a lap story time. Another example is Barnyard Banter, which has, you know, some great images, you know, really interesting illustrations. It gives children an opportunity to practice those animal sounds, which is always great for early development. And it's not super text heavy. And then the last one I have is All of Baby Nose to Toes. And babies especially love looking at other babies. I'm sure you've all seen the video of babies looking at themselves in the mirror. They may not realize it's themselves, but they get super excited. So this is kind of the same concept. And this one also has some elements that can be made interactive. Caregivers can interact with their child, practice different body parts. And again, it's not super text heavy. It's really simple. And so for toddlers, prioritize simple stories that aren't too wordy. So books that only have 1 or 2 sentences of text per page and have simple but fun and bright illustrations. And again, books that have a repetitive or active element will likely be more engaging because they can encourage the children to participate in the story, you know, versus just sitting and listening. So a few books I have: Eric Carle, From Head to Toe. Eric Carle, typically most of his books work really well for pretty much any age group for story time. And a lot of them, like Head to Toe, they can be made really easily interactive. You know, I'm an elephant and I stomp my foot. Can you do it? You can have all the kids, you know, practice stomping their feet. So this is really great, simple. The illustrations are always simple but really interesting. Another one I have is Hooray for Fish by Lucy Cousins. This one, again, really simple, really interesting, bright illustrations. But it also, this one in particular, is a great one. You know, you can practice counting. I think there's some colors in here. There's some rhyming in here. So kind of a great way to just hit on a bunch of different skills. And then Freight Train is a classic. It's really simple. Kids love it. You know, you focus on your different colors. It's super simple. You know, again, not too much text. Images are really simple and easy to see. But even though this is not a board book, you might also want to just check that this is appropriate for the size of your group since it is a smaller book. And so for preschoolers, you can begin picking more complex stories. But be careful about stories that are too long or wordy. And you can also ask simple comprehension and predictive questions to help aid in the development of foundational early literacy skills. So Little White Rabbit, a lot of Kevin Hinkey's books, for example, the Mouse books would probably, I love those books, they're some of my favorite, but they probably would be a little too complex for a preschooler story time. But a lot of his other books, like Little White Rabbit, are fantastic. They have beautiful illustrations. They're still relatively simple, you know, it's only a sentence or two. For example, in this book, Little White Rabbit is wondering what it's like to be tall. So you could have the children show you what they think it would be like to be tall. You could really quickly ask 1 or 2. You could ask what they're gonna wonder next. So that's one example. Mouse Paint, again, is another classic. And this one, you know, is just great for practicing those colors. There's so many different types of crafts and activities that you could do. You could incorporate a felt board, and the other books in this series would also be great for a preschooler story time. And then Don't Push the Button is a good example of an interactive book. And something like this, if you've read this, it's short, it's not super text heavy. and it's really funny and silly, which kids always love. And this, I just kind of wanted to talk about too. It's going to be over and over and over again. Don't push the red button. So that's also something where you can make a choice. Are you going to let maybe kids come up one at a time and push it? That might end in a little bit of jealousy. You know, you could make buttons ahead of time for something like this, you know, or if you're doing another book that has an interactive element, you could say, okay, everybody get out your hand, the button's right there, and then we're gonna push it. So that's also something that has a great interactive element, but there might be a little bit more work before you start, just to make sure that you're avoiding potential everybody running up to try to touch the book. And then for mixed age story time, so ones where maybe you're not targeting a specific age group, you're just saying anybody's welcome, you know, early childhood, anybody's welcome. A lot of the books that you might consider for toddler story time would probably be a good sweet spot, because they're not going to be too complex for younger children, but they're still going to be interesting and funny enough to hold older children's attention. So again, Eric Carle books, honestly, these can work for any age group. But these ones I picked in particular because they have that repetitive element of, you know, what do you hear? I hear a blank. I see a blank. So that's something that children can easily participate in. And it's not too text heavy. The images are really bright and fun and simple. Dog's Colorful Day is another example. This is one that can easily be made interactive. It can, you know, turn into a felt pretty easily. And it's not super text heavy. And then Go Away, Big Green Monster. I tried to kind of pick classics for this versus more obscure titles, because I figured these are books that you're more likely to have in your collection, or books that you've probably already used in a story time, or that you're just more familiar with. And you might say, oh yeah, that makes sense why I always gravitate towards that for my preschool story time, or why, you know, I maybe use this book for our lap story time. And then another fun one that can be used for mixed ages is Go Away, Big Green Monster. You know, not super text heavy. You know, can be interactive. You can have the children participate. It's very simple. All right, and then let's talk a little bit about finger plays, action songs, and lap bounces. So some movement activities that you can do during story time are finger plays, action songs, and lap bounces. These are a great way to allow children to practice their motor skills while being engaged and having fun. The specifics for what you do for this portion of story time really differ depending on age and personal preference. The complexity of the finger plays that you pick and the action songs that you choose could depend pretty heavily on the age you're working with and where they're at with those skills. Lap bounces are a fantastic alternative for very young children who haven't maybe mastered the skills of complex finger plays, action songs. Maybe they're not standing independently, not jumping independently. And so lap bounces can also give children and caregivers an opportunity to bond. And then these are just a few resources that you can find finger plays, action songs, or lap bounces. You can use online blogs like the ones I mentioned in slide 7, and that will be in the description. You can find them on places like YouTube, Pinterest. There are also some great books available in MLC's catalog that would be really helpful resources for planning your story time. And while it can be great to incorporate songs that are on your theme, it's always fun to pull out a few favorites if you need them that children will know and they can be excited about. And don't stress about having everything perfectly on theme. Like maybe you're doing a story time about unicorns. There's probably not going to be, I could be completely wrong because I haven't researched it a ton, but there's probably not going to be a ton of finger plays, action songs, lap bounces about unicorns, and that's totally okay. Not all of your songs have to perfectly fit your theme. And so you can also do dances, stretches, or other movement activities. Like most of Storytime, this again is really up to you. You could play music, you could use shakers or scarves. You can really just do anything that gets kids up and moving and practicing those gross motor skills, especially after they've been sitting for a story. It can also give children the opportunity to shake their sillies out before you move on to maybe the craft or activity portion of your Storytime program. If you want to play pre-recorded music, you can find great playlists of popular children's dance songs on platforms like Spotify or Apple Music, as well as suggested classics by popular children's artists. Kids Bop songs are also a really fun option, and you can find a lot of great ideas on online blogs or in the books in MLC's catalog. If you choose to use a video, make sure that you have permission to show it. If it's like on YouTube or something, it should have pretty explicit permission given. If it doesn't explicitly say that you can use it, don't use it. You can, if there's a specific dance you wanted to use, you can maybe try to practice those movements yourself. And if you do choose to show a video, if it says that you're able to show it, make sure that you vet it by watching it ahead of time and just being aware that if you watch it on YouTube, you can't control what ads can appear. Even if you preload it and you watch that initial ad, a lot of YouTube videos now will have, 2 or 3 more ads throughout the course of the video. So just kind of be cognizant and be aware of that. And so when you're ending story time, consider using the same closing songs every week to keep things consistent, as a way to signify, okay, we're wrapping things up, we're done, we're gonna move into the craft or activity portion. Lots of welcome songs also have a goodbye version, so you could use both versions of the same song just to kind of keep things consistent, if you would. So like one of my favorite welcome songs for babies and young toddlers is Wake Up Feet. You could turn that into Goodbye Feet or Goodnight Feet. And then after your closing song, you're going to transition your group into the craft or activity portion of the program. So decide how you would like this time to be structured ahead of time. Will you do each step together? Will you front load the directions and allow caregivers to guide their children? Will you kind of just pass out materials and let the children do as they do? So that's kind of something you can change from week to week how you want to do it. One week you could have something where there's specific steps they need to take, and then one week have something where you just say, go nuts, have fun. And that's totally fine. We'll talk a little bit more about that and why that is probably a good idea to do sometimes. Okay, so there we go. So craft versus activity. So for toddlers and preschool age children, completing a craft is a great way to practice their fine motor skills. The developmental series will cover more about what types of crafts and materials are appropriate for different age groups, as well as easy ways you could differentiate. And consider using both process and product art. That's a little bit what I was just talking about. So process art allows children the opportunity to explore materials with freedom to create whatever they would like with those given materials. So they build their confidence in their creative abilities. They have that freedom to just do whatever they would like and be creative. Where product art has a more particular end goal in mind. So maybe they're making a rainbow and they need to paint the rainbow, Roy G. Biv colors, and then they need to glue on cotton balls as the clouds. That would be an example of product art. And it has that particular end goal in mind, and it's more focused on following instructions and using their materials in a certain way. And there's a place for both. You could switch it up. Maybe you do process art one week, product art the next. And for babies, having a craft probably isn't going to be super realistic. If you choose to do a craft, it should be more of a sensory experience. Honestly, a lot of time that's just going to be playing with paint. Which is fantastic. Babies love that. Could be a little messy, but there's some great ways you can get around that. But you can also just do an activity, maybe set out targeted sensory bins, set out certain toys and just allow them to have playtime with other children, and allow the caregiver space to interact. So it's really up to you. And again, you don't have to do the same thing every week for that. One week you could do sensory bins. The next week you could just say, okay, we're going to get out, you have 10 children. We're going to get out toys and let them share. We're going to get out the Duplos. It's really whatever works best for you. And so it might also be a good idea to keep an emergency storytime kit on hand. Things can happen, an idea might fall through at the last minute, you might be sick, So it's a good idea to keep something on hand that anybody, could pick up that box, open it, and be ready to go. So here are a few things to keep in mind while you're planning that. You can use Post-its to pre-plan questions that can be asked while you're reading. Stick those on the pages where they're needed. They can pull them off as they go. You can type out lyrics and movements to any songs you plan to sing. You could even say, we're not going to stick to a theme. Here's a few ones that I use. I alternate and use at least once a month. My group definitely knows this, so it'll be easy for them to follow along. And then you can also include step-by-step instructions, including where to find any additional supplies or props that may be needed. Like if they need to get paint or, markers or glue sticks, anything like that, make sure they know where to find it. And if you have time, I would even maybe suggest creating a kit for each age group that you offer story time for, so that way someone who's maybe not done story time for a group of babies before is not trying to do a preschool age story time. You're helping to set them up for success. And so here are just a couple more things to think about. See if you can add books for this purpose to your professional collection so that they're not being circulated and they can always be available when they're needed. You could also use donations. Since these books won't be circulating, you can use books that maybe wouldn't have been suitable for your circulating collection, like maybe books that are paperbacks and are flimsy and would have probably gotten torn up if they'd been put into your circulating collection. And the ALSC blog has some suggestions that could help you to get started. And Knox County Storytime to-go kits are cool. So they're actually for patrons to check out, but they have listed in the description of each for all the different themes, what books they include, what crafts they include. So that's somewhere great you could utilize if you're having trouble brainstorming. And so thank you so much for joining today's webinar. I hope you found this session on Storytime valuable and gained new insights. So you can stay connected with us for more learning opportunities by subscribing to our YouTube channel, and feel free to share your feedback in the comments. We look forward to seeing you soon. And if you have any questions, or you maybe want to talk more about specific ideas, specific books, specific types of story times, feel free to shoot me an email. My email's on the slide right there, or you can give me a call.